Thank you very much for that kind introduction and for the invitation to join you all this evening. I would like to acknowledge that we're meeting today in Lutruwita. We are meeting on the lands of the Muanina people. They belong to the oldest continuing culture in the world, and they cared for and protected country for thousands of years. And I acknowledge also the Palawa and Pakana people of this island who have survived invasion and dispossession and continue to maintain their identity, family and connection to place, and that identity has been maintained in the face of great adversity and violence, including in the name of scientific endeavour. So I stand for a future that profoundly respects and acknowledges that Aboriginal perspective, culture, language and history. And I think that's particularly important to look where we are today in the context of this talk about Antarctica, because we find ourselves on the edge of the Southern Ocean. It's not that far to just look down the river and think about what's across that wide expanse. We see Noina, those southern lights, from our own backyards. And in doing so, we recognise Antarctica as a neighbour. It's a place both distant, but for many of us, very close to our daily lives. So today, I'd like to have a look at some of those connections with Antarctica, some of those lenses that we have used when looking at the place, and I'd like to look forward as well and think about how we would like that to look into the future. But first, we'll go back in time to this fellow. Some of you might recognise this face. One of the most well-known Australian explorers is, of course, Douglas Mawson. In 1913, Australian explorer Douglas Mawson penned a series of articles for the Adelie Blizzard, the newspaper of the Australasian Antarctic expedition. And in those articles, he explicitly outlined the economic value to be extracted from this continent. Now, his series was suggesting that things like whaling, sealing, fox farming, wind power, sanatoria and sightseeing could all be lucrative propositions for that continent. And while we haven't seen any health camps established in Antarctica, we have seen specialist dental cruises. Foxes have stayed north of Tasmania, but many of these other visions have come to pass. We do have wind power, for instance, at many of the bases as a green alternative. And when we look to those marine mammals, they have been valued in a range of different ways over time, both as a resource to be hunted and as wildlife to be appreciated in other ways. In fact, we could say that the history of resource extraction in the Antarctic is as old as the human interaction with that place, even if that's not the lens that we are most used to applying today. Because if we look back to those really early human interactions, back in the 1800s, we had people heading south specifically to hunt various animals. So coming down to look for fur seals. And that was really valuable information, the locations of those animals. And for that reason, many of those early records are not actually correct on purpose, so people wouldn't find out where those animals were. The captains were notoriously secretive about that. So our early interactions are unknown for some of that reason, for that commercial reason. Then we have the point where those seals are just about hunted to extinction for their blubber, their seals and their fur, but there were other animals that were also quite valuable. Whales, for instance. And this is one of the very early Antarctic advertisements that I was quite excited to find because of that very direct link between the far south and a product that was actually for sale in the northern hemisphere. This is Antarctic whalebone being the brand name in this case. This was the baleen that was being used for things like corsets in this case. You might see something a bit unusual in this print advertisement from 1890 though. Anyone spot something a bit lost? I'll zoom in to give you a clue. So these guys were a little bit lost, a couple of polar bears in the far south. But of course, at that point, there was still a lot that was unknown about the far south. And expeditions that were heading down were regularly having sponsorship, for instance, from firearms manufacturers, because they thought they might encounter these kinds of animals that they were familiar with from the far north. We still see instances of the poles being conflated, particularly in advertising. Depends on what is the idea that's trying to be got across. But this is a really early example of that explicit connection. And those poor penguins that were down south weren't immune either. Some of you may be aware of the story of Macquarie Island and Joseph Hatch, who was using the penguin scare for penguin oil. And talking to John just before the lecture here, he pointed out the imagery now. If you go down, you'll see these penguin digesters that were previously used to render down blubber from those penguins. They're now the home for penguins with nests in and around, so a bit of a switch. Because today, of course, we look at that region quite differently. We have the International Whaling Commission, we have the Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Seals, so we don't go down hunting these animals. But in terms of the human history of interactions with this place, I think it's worth keeping in mind that the way we see things now is not the way that it's always been. Today, we could look at the numbers of people coming down, estimated just over 130,000 tourists in the next season, not all doing landings. We have the larger vessels that are cruise only and smaller vessels that are offering those landing opportunities. But in many cases, it is that wildlife that is very much the attraction. And Antarctica itself is also the product in these cases, which we'll come back to. But we might also add some things to that list of Douglas Mawson. Antarctica is recognised as a very important strategic location for satellites, for communications technology. Things like biological prospecting have also seen Antarctic organisms used in products that are marketed back home, including skin creams, which make the promise of freezing time, for instance. And then we get periodic examples where people propose towing an iceberg north for fresh water. This one's from 1977, but we've seen examples more recently, for instance, from the UAE making these suggestions, which, as we look forward into a future where water security is more and more of a problem, we might expect to see more of these proposals, whether or not they are actually able to be realised or not, geopolitically or functionally. I think it shows us these different ways of thinking about Antarctica. But it does have these various connections to that commercial sphere, which can often be at odds with the version of what we think Antarctica is and what we think that it should be. So Antarctica is often perceived as that last unexploited place on Earth. And it is very special. It's governed and protected by the Antarctic Treaty System. So it's a place that's for peace, that's for science, but it hasn't always been this way. And that protection should also not be taken for granted. It takes a lot of work to establish an environmental protection regime like we have, and to maintain that as well. So just a reminder of where that's come from. That contemporary lens through which we view the Antarctic, figured as a place to protect, is relatively recent, with the Antarctic Treaty having been signed in 1959, with Australia as one of those 12 original signatories. And while the treaty doesn't have any expiry date, we have seen different instruments added as different concerns were raised. For instance, in response to activities like sealing or like interest in the Southern Ocean, in the marine living resources. So we have the Camelot Convention, which deals with fishing in the Southern Ocean. When there was a lot of interest in looking south for minerals, we had a lot of development of a framework that would have regulated mineral resource activity in the Antarctic, CREMRA, but that didn't come into effect. That was superseded by what we have today, the Madrid Protocol, or Protocol on Environmental Protection to the Antarctic Treaty. And that was very much to do with changing perceptions of what that place is for, and a lot of public pressure as well, particularly in places like Australia and France, saying what sort of a future do we want for this place. And the Madrid Protocol is what prevents mining in the Antarctic, what introduced those requirements for biosecurity, so very much shapes the activities that we do in the Antarctic today. It's also the reason that we don't take dogs to the Antarctic anymore, for instance. And again, that also doesn't expire. There's a provision that it could be looked at again. It could happen anytime if all the parties were wanting to do that. But I think what's special about this system is that it has responded to challenges over time, and it has responded as sort of that global view of the place has shifted and evolved. And that's also important because what we're talking about here is not actually so much what's happening in the Antarctic, but what's happening back home and that discourse around Antarctica. Why is that important? Because most people will never actually go to that southern continent. But that means that their experience of that place is very much mediated. It's mediated through different forms of cultural production. If you think back to your idea of Antarctica, if you've never been down or before you went down, what was it that was in your head shaping that view? I know for me, on my very first visit, I noticed I had a version of Antarctica because as we were going to Scott Base, the soundtrack accompanying that view of the white flat expanse was not the soaring orchestral music that I had been used to from films. It was Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which was really, it was quite jarring. It really, for me, made me think about where did this version of this place come from. So it can come from things like diaries of explorers, letters, novels. It can come from some of the very well-known images that circulate about the far south. Might come from films. You know, Happy Feet has been quite influential in my household. It might come from things like novels or artworks that have been produced by people who went down with artists in Antarctica programs. Or it might be artworks that's been created from afar about that connection. Or it might be something like this one too. You might be familiar with the text up here. The men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honour and recognition in case of success. I don't know how many people are putting their hands up for that, maybe a few. So there's not any evidence that this appeared as an advert for that particular expedition, but this text itself is one of the most replicated Antarctic texts, and it plays a really big role in shaping perceptions of that place. So Antarctica is somewhere that's really far away, it's really hazardous, where people pit themselves against that environment. And we see it coming up very often on mugs, on t-shirts, sort of as a marker of, you know, Antarctic inside as well. So those advertisements, I'm going to take you through a few more of those advertisements in a moment, but I wanted to stop off at that arts idea in a little bit more detail, because we have a research project at the moment that's looking at just that. So Creative Antarctica had interviews with a whole lot of artists and writers who had been south, both with the Australian program and with tour operators as well. Looking at those programs, how are they run? What are the experiences on them? What's been created and what happens once people come back as well? And of course, it's a whole range of different media. We've got music, we've got filmmaking, we've got visual arts, we've got writers as well. And they're really bringing Antarctica back home. and in that sense sort of engineering this encounter with the far south through their own eyes. And there will be an exhibition coming to Melbourne in early 2026 that will bring together a whole lot of these artworks for that experience as well, to try to build some of that connection and some of the community as well up in Melbourne amongst the creative people who have been down to the Antarctic and have been trying to bring some of these stories back, including more recent stories than those from the heroic era with people like Neilsen. Another way that we could try to see what are some of these stories and how have they been shifting is, as John mentioned, to look at some of those different lenses. And a really nice way to see those different cultural framings is to look at a cultural product that is designed to be understood immediately, such as advertising. As Judith Williamson puts it, ads are the great recyclers of images. They feed off the iconography of the present at the same time as perpetuating it. Because people creating these adverts know you're not going to spend a lot of time and energy looking. They need to get across a concept very, very quickly. So it needs to be something that will be understood just at a glance. So that's what I did in this project for Brand Antarctica, collecting a whole lot of advertisements across time, so from the heroic era until today, to look at what were those ideas that people selling either products or services, mostly products, were associating with Antarctica. Why were they calling on Antarctica to try to market their own product? Was it an idea to do with heroism? Was it that this product is really tough? Was it to do with purity or environmental protection? Or was it to do with the continent as a place that can transform, and that is a product in its own right? And this work, it also has policy relevance, because the policy decisions, such as to develop a new instrument to protect parts of Antarctica, are not made in a vacuum. And those cultural products, including advertisements, can help reveal why a place is seen as important or in need of protection. And they remind us that things haven't always been the same way. We also see, of course, NGOs very cognizant of this fact and using these campaigns to try to shape public opinion in different ways as well. So we'll take a closer look at some of those framings, but I'd also like to draw your attention to the fact that it's not just things from Antarctica that can be valuable and have been sold when we think about Antarctica in this broader commercial context. We also need to take a look at the stories. Photography and narrative. They also are some of these things that have been ways for expedition leaders to fund their expeditions. And Antarctica is really unique because those first land-based expeditions were taking place at a time when photography was already available. And not only available, but recognised as a really powerful tool for bringing people in. So camera artists like Herbert Ponting, like Frank Hurley, travelled south with the explicit aim of documenting those expeditions. In fact, in some cases, they were explicitly sought out because of their skills in that area. So this is the only continent where those first human interactions and forays, inland in particular, were both recorded and also rapidly distributed to a very large reading public back home. And that was providing fuel for the imagination and providing a really valuable addition to the pages of these magazines and newspapers, because that geographical exploration was very much dramatised to appeal to a wider audience. And that in turn turned the explorer into something of a celebrity. So expeditions were these carefully orchestrated narratives that were structured in order to maximise publicity and dramatic appeal, and sometimes very explicitly so. We see examples of polar expeditions in the north where the contract with this media sponsor stipulated different amounts to be paid depending on what could be achieved. If a rendezvous at a particular time was worth a higher amount, for instance. So news barons like George Nunes and William Randolph Hearst both benefited from and helped to create this hero business, because as those stories of exploration reached home, they were marketed by that existing media network that was hungry for new content, and that was visual content and written content. In Hobart here, we also saw the results of this need to sell your story when we had the expedition returning from the South Pole with Roald Amundsen coming to Hobart and keeping that news of his reaching the pole secret until that had reached the newspaper, because it had previous experiences of that leaking and losing that funding associated with the scoop. And this fellow here is Carsten Borchgrevink. He was an Anglo-Norwegian immigrant to Australia, and he really knew the value of selling that story. So his Southern Cross expedition in 1897 was both the first private Antarctic expedition and the first to winter on the continent, and that was financed by George Nunes. So although there had been expeditions south before, this was a very explicit contract of, you will publish my story and I will be funded to do this exploration. So that's sort of the context in which we're operating. It's in the pages of these magazines that we see the very first advertisements that draw on that Antarctic connection and really use that idea of the hero and of sponsorship and these well-known figures, the Scotts, the Shackletons, the Mawsons as well. So the example here for his master's voice, you'll see a photograph from in the Antarctic, and they'd posed their dog by the gramophone to look like the logo. Not only that, they also sent a message back to London saying, we have taken a photo of our dogs looking like your logo. You might want to use that in your advertising. They did, but they also quoted the message that was sent back. That's sort of the little box underneath the dog is the message. So it's giving this idea of this product was used in Antarctica and works very well. It will work fine for you. Similarly with the Bovril there, although Bovril has its whole own history to do with sort of masculinity and virility and keeping bodies alive in difficult situations, that made it a good fit for Ernest Shackleton to say it must be Bovril. Another explorer who's very well known in the US context was a master of this publicity and of selling his own story in advance to get funding for expeditions, and that's Admiral Richard Byrd. And he went to Antarctica several times, but his second expedition is particularly of note because he knew he needed to get attention and funding. He knew if you could achieve a first, that was what would get all the attention. People had already been down to the Antarctic, they'd mapped things. He needed something different. So he decided he would take some cows with him. They hadn't had cows in Antarctica before, but he hedged his bets. He also took a pregnant cow because there definitely had not been a calf born in Antarctica. So he packed them up on his ship, made special deals also with the people who provided the food for the cows and the stalls for the cows. There was a whole booklet explaining what brands he was using. And then when the calf was finally born, just north of the Antarctic Circle, because of the sea ice, they also could send that news back and have headlines in the paper about that, and use the cows on their return to raise funds for the next expedition. So he was very much orchestrating this media spectacle. We see examples too where Byrd was leveraging his own name, so this idea of sponsorship, and Byrd used it, therefore it's an excellent product. But we also see echoes of some of these earlier explorers from the heroic era too, and even some modern day imagery. So this example, which was for a Glenfiddich, for a whiskey, very much using that picture of man hauling, so people pitting their bodies against the environment, reprising some of that heroic era imagery. And the story, the alignment of the story of the product and the Antarctic is what's really important. So they sponsored the British team which competed in the Walking with the Wounded expedition in 2012, which saw wounded war veterans or modern day heroes walk in the footsteps of heroic era figures to the South Pole. And the senior brand manager of Glenfiddich explained that the stories they tell, the inspirational people and how they have overcome challenges, has a spirit which matches our heritage. And whiskey too is the quintessential explorer's drink. It's very much steeped in history, in character, in technology. So this Antarctic trek was a really good fit for that brand. And we see in some of that campaign which rolled out across the UK, these themes of masculinity, of nationalism, also with that tagline, spirit of a nation, that coming through as well. And the movement across the landscape. In this case, it's very different figures to in the heroic era, which was, of course, all men. This was men and women of different backgrounds and not necessarily able-bodied also, but you can't see that from the image, and that's what this is sort of calling upon, the echoes of that story of the hero. So one of these other framings that's also used in Antarctic advertisements is that extremity. It often comes through as the idea of as used in Antarctica, or Antarctica as that final frontier, the ultimate testing ground. And we see that in quite a few vehicle advertisements, or with the tagline as used in Antarctica, because it's sort of the ultimate testimonial. Antarctica is this place of superlatives: highest, coldest, windiest, driest, most remote continent. And that's what was being called upon in this advertisement here for VW. Absolutely was not the first car in Antarctica. Shackleton had also taken down a motor vehicle, but it was the first time that anyone had made that claim. And it was also a campaign that rolled out not only across Australia, and the car itself was used at an Australian station for a season. It had quite an afterlife too back in Australia. There was a film made about it. But it was also the campaign that ran in the USA. So this is not actually the Antarctic car. It's a picture that was taken for the US market, left-hand drive, right-hand drive, but the claim's still the same. And then we have instances of Australian Antarctic scientists meeting with US Antarctic scientists and making the joke, oh, we knew you had a presence in Antarctica because we saw the advert about the car. But this idea of firsts very much also links to the heroic era and this desire to be the first to the pole, the first to map. And we see it with different products as well. Often products that are used to help keep you alive, whether that be through oil, so keeping the vehicles running, whether it be through clothing. The example up here is for a type of jacket with the tagline that said, "Extremity can't be tested in a lab." And in that case, they actually sponsored an expedition to the Antarctic with some very talented snowboarders, or talented or fearless, I'm not sure. They made a video snowboarding on some of the edge of some of the glaciers, and then used that to market these jackets and these products. So the idea that it works down there, it will be great for you back home. And many, many watchmakers have called upon that as well, which is interesting in the Antarctic context. When you're far enough south that you have 24-hour daylight, keeping time can be something that gets a little difficult. And this one as well, a more recent example, but I've put this in because it's kind of got similarities to the heroic era where a particular well-known explorer said use this product. In this case, the National Antarctic Program stands in for the explorer. This is clothing used by the New Zealand Antarctic Program, but it's also public-facing advertising so anyone in the public can buy it. The idea is it's used by this program, so it must be very hardy and must work very well. So the image there is from one of the kitchens, I think out on Windless Bight. They're sort of covered in the snow as they're sitting out there in the kitchen. These are not the only ways we could look at the far south, though. There are ideas that continue to be reprised, but sometimes we see particularly advertisements that try to take another approach. And rather than framing Antarctica as a place for people or for machinery to test their limits, they frame Antarctica as a place that should remain untouched by cars, by exploration. And they're invoking ideas of purity, of freshness, of pristine conditions. We see that this is actually a label from a beer, but it's talking about being the world's purest beer. The beer here was made including some ice from an iceberg in the Antarctic, which of course to get that they had to go down into the Southern Ocean and take it out. So we get some really interesting paradoxes often when the purity idea is called upon. It's actually most often used in products that come from the Antarctic, whether that's a beverage or something like a krill oil as well, which is of course on the shelves of many of the chemists back home. But a lot of those campaigns use that imagery, the white icebergs, to suggest this really clean, pure place, suggesting health benefits for that particular product. This penguin is actually a bit lost. It's not an Antarctic species, but in many ways it doesn't matter because penguins can be used to stand in for that far south. And what's really interesting in more recent years with computer-generated imagery is it's easier and easier to create an Antarctica if you want to have some kind of a symbolic connection with your product. A lot of my work was looking at print advertising, but we see it also in some of the sort of film media as well. And in the last few years, it's become exponentially easier, which is really interesting. You don't have to go to the Antarctic. You don't have to have any connection with the Antarctic other than an idea that you're creating because of one of these particular frames here. And of course, no iceberg with penguins would look quite that clean anyway. But the idea in that particular campaign was a lot of these pictures of the tip of the iceberg, calling upon that figure of speech, dive deeper, wanting to say we're a very environmentally friendly company that was tied in with an MSC certification, in that case, that campaign. And sometimes we see that language used in advertisements for visits as well. So an example of a trip to the Antarctic where they were using that pristine Antarctica as the headline. And what we did see for quite some time was this desire of tour operators to sort of keep away from one another and out of sight, this promise of a place that's untouched and pristine, and that purity idea. That's not so much the case now, so ships don't necessarily hide from each other. There's an acceptance that people are in the Antarctic, and it's not shied away from, but it certainly is something that we have seen in some of that advertising previously for the place itself. And then we come to ideas of fragility. A little bit different from the purity, but often connected. So seeing this continent as a place to protect, but usually framed as by our product, protect that place. In this case, we often see pictures of carving icebergs or melting ice caps, which can be used as that shorthand for climate change, for global environmental issues. And that does come through in advertising. And this is another area more recently where sometimes the poles can be conflated too, because the ice is sending a similar message about vulnerability of natural environment. But we also see what can be known as ice washing. So you might have heard of greenwashing, when a product is advertised in a way to suggest it has particular environmental credentials, whether or not it does. And ice washing is when we see that icy imagery being used to suggest an environmental focus by this product protect that penguin or that ice cape or by extension that continent. So the Westpac example here is really typical of that kind of a use, and there's a whole host of advertisements that this is also a stock image that's been used. It's appeared in other adverts as well, but often to suggest being a leader, as we see with the tagline here, how many banks does it take to change a globe, which of course is a play on the wordplay on the light bulbs, but also suggesting they are up front, like being the first. This was to do with sort of new water regulations. And the fact there's only one penguin is quite interesting too, because usually when you see these imagery, there's a whole lot of penguins all jumping in, so suggesting being a leader. The other advert up here, though, I think is really interesting because it's referring directly to the warming of the planet. It says in the corner, global warming ready. And it's part of a series. We saw different very well-known locations around the world, so the Eiffel Tower, for instance, sort of with a beachy landscape, so very much warmer than what you would see today. And here we see people wearing swimwear with penguins in the background, suggesting a future where Antarctica has no ice. Again, they're not an Antarctic species, but that's what they're often understood to be. But why this is significant is it's indicating that concept of climate change has permeated that popular consciousness enough for Antarctica to be used as a shorthand for these issues in general cultural production. This was just one of that series that was designed to be understood quite quickly. It also, of course, with clothing advertisements, they do often try to be quite provocative to get more attention for campaigns, which in this case certainly did happen. And then we've got some kind of different approaches to this as well. So we have some of these ideas of extremity, we have some of these ideas of environmental protection coming together when Metallica had a concert in the Antarctic. So that was called the Freeze 'Em All concert, December 2013. It was sponsored by Coke Zero, which was again a sort of a play on, 0 degrees freezing. Zero environmental impact was how they were trying to promote this as well. So there's a very long environmental impact assessment about this particular concert. They wanted to be the first to perform on all continents within a year. So again, harking back to some of those heroic ideas of being the first to the pole or the first to step on a continent. And so to be kind to the penguins, it was a silent disco style with everyone wearing their earphones to hear the music. And then that was, of course, supported by one of the tour vessels. So the people who had tickets to that concert were coming down together on the Ortelius specifically for that event, which sort of brings us into, again, Antarctica as that product, and the advertisements for Antarctic tourism, which is kind of a whole area in its own right, particularly in recent years as we've seen diversification of that market and many more activities available, things like kayaking, like scuba diving, ships having helicopters, ships having submersibles. But the advertisements are really important because they sell that promise of the place. That's going to be the first encounter of sort of people who want to buy that product, but they also sort of spread these ideas about the place just by, being there in the in-flight magazine, for instance. We see things like calling upon the idea of heroes quite explicitly sometimes. So walk in the footsteps of Shackleton. There was a sort of 5 or 6 year period of centenary Shackleton voyages, also when I was guiding, or in the wake of Mawson. Well, you see some of that in terms of the positioning of the bodies and sort of the gazing out at the landscape as well, which is often pure landscape, untouched by humans. But again, it's really interesting to see how these images have changed over time. And they have also shifted in response to sort of changes in environmental regulations as well. Some of the images we used to see, for instance, of icebergs with very large arches, and it looked like small vessels were quite close. That's not the sort of image that would appear now. Again, because that sets up the expectations of what is this experience that you're going to have. We wouldn't see images of penguins on people's laps because there are minimum approach distances, for instance. And I think that idea of the expectation and that Antarctic imaginary that those guests carry with them is actually really important within that Antarctic tourism industry as well, particularly for the guides, the people who mediate those encounters. We see that when we see, for instance, some of those old sites of whaling or sealing activity in the Antarctic. People might have an expectation of one thing and encounter something different. So in many ways, being a guide is all about navigating that Antarctic imaginary. How do we conceptualize Antarctica? The wide open expanses, the blue skies, the penguins, the icebergs, but also these layers of human history, which are not always that beautiful and might also not sit with the way that we think this place should be treated just now. So that raises some interesting questions about how we mediate that, which is one of the things that our research group here at the University of Tasmania looks at through our Antarctic tourism research program. So we've got people with expertise in tourism, with expertise in literature, in governance, also things like behaviour change, taking that multidisciplinary approach to understanding tourism in that Antarctic region, because we want to help make that activity enriching and environmentally sustainable. It's happening and it will continue happening. How can we try to make that something positive that can benefit policymakers, operators, tourists, scientists as well, and the Antarctic region. So some of the projects we have underway in that regard were based on ships, so interviews with tourists on the way down, what are those ideas about the place on the way back again as well, and with guides too, about those encounters. And that having a group of people doing that helps with all those different angles as well. And talking to guides and talking to people who work in the Antarctic, I think is a really important aspect here too, when we're thinking about these representations of the far south. Because another area where that imagery can play an important role is in the recruitment of staff. And I know some of you may know people working or who have worked in the Antarctic before. And when we have a look at the imagery that's often used in recruitment, many times it's harking back to that heroic era idea of people out in the environment. And in reality, a very good person-environment fit is often someone who can work inside in the same environment under artificial lighting for a long time, because that's often what's happening. But we see these themes of heroism and extremity present, and National Antarctic programs are really aware of how they present themselves, more so in recent years, but this example from Antarctica, New Zealand, I think makes that quite stark. So it's based on a meme format, so the different images, what I hope I'll be doing, what my parents think I'll be doing, what my friends think I'll be doing, what I'll tell my Facebook friends I'll be doing, you know, that heroic image on social media, what I'll actually be doing, maybe not quite as exciting, what it'll look like by the end of the season. So although the living and working conditions in the Antarctic have changed a lot since those first heroic era explorers headed south, the representations often continue to reprise that heroic imagery. And that matters because if we frame Antarctica as a comfortable workplace rather than an extreme place for undertaking adventure, you can actually get better outcomes when you are trying to employ the right people for that particular environment. So building teams that will be much more effective down south. You know, a few other examples of how that continent has been marketed previously. Again, that sort of figure in the snow, and a bit of a riddle there too. And that has been changing, but I think it's a really interesting area to look at too. And it also raises questions about who's included and who's not included, who sees themselves represented or not, which is a wider question within the Antarctic research community as well. And I think it's also really important to understand what's happening back home. What do people think about the far south? How do they see their own relationship with the ice? A few examples up here from in Hobart, some of the places you might encounter, the Mawson's huts down on the waterfront, the picture that says Hobart, Tasmania. It's a gateway that was down at the international port, so people coming off the cruise ships. We have, of course, the excellent polar pathways booklet as well. It's been through some iterations, so sort of showing those different sites within the city and activating some of those connections. And John Williamson too has taken some of those tours around, highlighting if it's a connection that's through some of the rocks, for instance, or a connection that's through the skies, or a connection through something like a piece of public art that's referring to someone, in this case Louis Benaki, who was from the area. But there are many layers within this city, and my colleague Katie Marks has done a lot of work about how people see their connection and what some of those barriers might be for building that connection into the future. A really recent example that was reaching some different audiences was the Beaker Street Festival, which had a Hobartica event on the waterfront. So a sauna, and you could sit in some Antarctic ice-cold water. So to try to get that bodily experience and connection with that place too. So I think there's a lot more that we can be doing to bring those stories to the fore, but it's also important to think about what stories we want to be foregrounding, because Antarctica has been seen through those different lenses, represented in different ways for different reasons, and how people view that situation depends on that Antarctic imaginary. That's that cluster of values, of tropes and ideas that they associate with the place, that's shaped by those cultural inputs. So when we think about what we have now and what future we want to see for Antarctica, it's useful to look back on some of those past visions, like Mawson's fox farming, the development of instruments like Camelot for the Southern Ocean, so that we can articulate what we think is important today. And in closing, I would say it's not just scientists who hold those keys to Antarctica's future, although they play a very important role. There's a much wider community involved in the Antarctic, and also the community beyond that also has a stake. So that question of what kind of future we want to see is a very human question, and it's based on the values and priorities of us very far from the ice. And as we look at climate change, we have growing questions around human impacts and the ethics of travel. We have sea level rise coming to many low-lying nations, which can result in people feeling some kind of a connection with very far off places. It's important to have a clear understanding of Antarctica, both in terms of physical processes and what that continent means to us. So in closing, I would say culture is not peripheral, but rather central to this process. And that imagery is powerful in shaping our views of Antarctica. So it's a really good time for everyone to ask what they would like those views to be. Thank you.
Hanne, thank you very much indeed. Before I thank Hanne completely, we do have time for just a couple of questions. You will need to sing it out quite loudly, and we'll repeat the question so that everyone can hear. So,
Hanne, has anyone tried to sell real estate in Antarctica?
Has anyone tried to sell real estate in Antarctica? Great question. I know they've tried to sell air from Antarctica. I think I did see a campaign a while back, but it was not actually selling real estate. It was sort of just to make a point about the company. Yeah, but the air was really, people were going down and catching very fresh air and selling it in tanks back home.
Where do you see the direction of scientific research going in Antarctica and
So what's the direction of scientific research in Antarctica and how it relates to climate change? I think that the cooperation is really important. It's been important in the Antarctic context ever since before the signing of the Antarctic Treaty, but we're seeing that more and more so today. So international collaboration, particularly when we see things like climate change and we have this desire to reduce the human footprint, so to make the most of any voyage that is going down. There is really a very strong need for funding for a variety of different projects as well to find out more. So this link between the models and sort of what's done on the ground, that's really important. And I think cooperation again can help with that too. So for making sure that you're getting those longer time series that you need, and you have different countries working together, you can have more resources. So I think that is a way to be looking, but my colleagues working on the ground would always say yes, the support in terms of resources, super important. And then I would say to that as well, it's also really important that people know what research is happening and why we should care about it. So those stories too.
Hanne, thank you so much for that. In one sense, I was thinking this is about how and why Antarctica has been commodified, and also the way in which the most isolated region on the Earth has been domesticated. It's sublime, it's traumatic, but it's been domesticated too. But what I found wonderful was that your vast knowledge of these things and that those lenses has helped us to clarify, and you've explained to us how and why we perceive and interpret Antarctica. And that was the real key. Would you join me in thanking Hanne for a really good lecture?